This mark, it runs in our family.
Grandma grabs Waitress's arm. This birthmark, it means you might be. The clatter of silverware and the soft murmur of dinner conversation usually filled Brooke Miller's world. But one Tuesday evening, that familiar soundtrack screeched to a halt. It wasn't a dropped tray or an angry customer that caused the disruption. Instead, it was a hand, a surprisingly strong, cold hand that clamped down on her arm with the force of a metal cuff. Brooke gasped, hot coffee sloshing precariously in the pot she was holding. An elderly woman, draped in pearls and smelling faintly of lavender, was staring at her wrist with an intensity that felt like a physical burn. The woman's faded blue eyes were wide, filled with a look of almost frantic discovery. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice both fragile and demanding. Before Brooke could even formulate an answer, the woman's grip tightened, her knuckles turning white. She looked up, her gaze locking with Brooke's, and announced to the stunned restaurant, "That birthmark, it runs in our family." Brooke Miller had always believed her life was made up of unremarkable moments, stitched together by the monotonous rhythm of shifts at the Gilded Spoon, a restaurant that was far less glamorous than its name suggested. Her days were a blur of taking orders, refilling drinks, and forcing a smile for customers who rarely saw her as anything more than a pair of hands. At 24, her world felt small and contained, defined by her cramped studio apartment, her towering stack of community college textbooks, and the dull ache in her feet at the end of a 10-hour shift. She was an orphan, a word that felt stark and cold even to her own ears. Raised in a series of foster homes, she had no baby pictures, no family heirlooms, no stories of a doting grandfather or a mother's lullaby. Her only tangible connection to a past she couldn't remember was a peculiar birthmark on the inside of her right wrist, a perfect coffee-colored crescent moon. It was her secret anchor, a piece of her personal history that no one else could claim. That Tuesday evening had started out aggressively ordinary. The dinner rush was just beginning to slow down, and Brooke was carefully navigating the narrow space between tables, a fresh pot of coffee in hand. Table 7, a party of 3, had been her focus for the past hour. An elegant, silver-haired woman. A man in a crisp suit who looked to be her son. And a younger man, perhaps in his late 20s, with a dismissive air and a phone that seemed permanently glued to his hand. They seemed out of place among the restaurant's usual clientele of weary shoppers and office workers. They radiated a quiet, intimidating wealth. Brooke approached their table. "More coffee for anyone?" she asked, offering her practiced, polite smile. The older man, Robert, gave a slight nod. "Just for my mother. Thank you." As Brooke leaned over to pour, her sleeve slid back an inch, briefly exposing her wrist. And that's when it happened. The elderly woman's hand shot out, her fingers wrapping around Brooke's arm with a strength that belied her frail appearance. Brooke froze, the coffee pot hovering precariously over the table. The woman, whose name she now knew was Beatrice Davenport, wasn't just holding her. She was gripping her, turning her arm over to get a better look at the crescent moon. "Where did you get that?" Beatrice's voice was a ragged whisper, but it cut through the restaurant's low hum. Brooke was too stunned to speak, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was bizarre, aggressive. People at nearby tables were starting to stare. The younger man, Nathan, finally looked up from his phone, his expression a mixture of annoyance and embarrassment. "Mother, for heaven's sake, let the girl go," he muttered, not even looking at Brooke. "You're making a scene." But Beatrice was lost in her own world. Her thumb traced the outline of the birthmark, her touch both trembling and firm. A wild, desperate hope ignited in her faded blue eyes. She looked up, directly into Brooke's confused and frightened face. "That birthmark," she said, her voice rising with conviction, gaining strength. "The crescent moon. It runs in our family. It's my Josephine's mark." The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent. Brooke could feel a hot blush creeping up her neck. She tried to pull her arm away, but the old woman's grip was unyielding. "Ma'am, please," Brooke stammered, her professional composure cracking. I was born with it. I don't know what you're talking about." Robert, the son, finally stood up, his face a mask of controlled apology. He placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. "Mother, calm down. You're upsetting her." He turned his apologetic eyes to Brooke. "I am so sorry. My mother, she gets confused sometimes. She lost her daughter a very, very long time ago." "I am not confused, Robert," Beatrice snapped, her voice cracking with emotion. "I would know that mark anywhere. It's hers. It has to be her." Her eyes filled with tears, which began to carve paths through the fine powder on her cheeks. She was looking at Brooke, not as a waitress, but as a ghost, a miracle. Brooke finally wrenched her arm free, stumbling back a step. The coffee pot clattered as she set it down on a nearby table. She was trembling, a cocktail of fear, anger, and profound embarrassment coursing through her. I think you have the wrong person," Brooke said, her voice barely a whisper. She wanted to run, to disappear into the kitchen, and never come out. The manager, Mr. Henderson, was now rushing over, his face pinched with concern. "Is there a problem here?" Nathan spoke up, his tone dripping with venomous condescension. "No problem. My grandmother just had a momentary lapse. We're leaving." He threw a $100 bill onto the table, more than enough to cover the check, and began to usher his grandmother to her feet. Beatrice resisted, her gaze still locked on Brooke. "No, we can't just leave. Look at her eyes, Robert. They're just like hers." Robert, looking mortified, took a firmer hold of his mother's arm. He then did something unexpected. He pulled a pen and a business card from his jacket pocket. He scribbled something on the back and pressed it into Brooke's hand. "My sincerest apologies for this scene," he said, his voice low and earnest. "My mother hasn't been herself lately, but for her peace of mind, would you be willing to call me just to talk? We would be happy to compensate you for your time and for this disturbance." Brooke stared at the card. It was thick, expensive card stock. Robert Davenport, CEO, Davenport Industries. Below it was a handwritten cell phone number. She looked from the card to the family. Nathan was glaring at her as if she'd orchestrated the whole thing. Robert looked genuinely conflicted. And Beatrice? Beatrice looked utterly broken, a lifetime of grief etched onto her face as her son led her away. As they left, a profound silence hung over the restaurant before the whispers began. Brooke stood frozen, the business card feeling like a hot coal in her palm. The crescent moon on her wrist, once a quiet, personal symbol, now felt like a brand, a question mark that had just been shouted to the world. Her unremarkable life had just been violently interrupted, and she had a terrifying feeling that nothing would ever be the same. The business card sat on Brooke's cramped kitchen counter for 2 days, a stark white rectangle of possibility and dread. She'd pick it up, feel the embossed letters of Davenport Industries, and immediately put it down again. Her roommate, Jessica, a pragmatic nursing student, was less conflicted. "You have to call, Brooke. This is straight out of a movie," Jessica said, gesturing with a spoonful of yogurt. "An eccentric, rich family, a long-lost heir, a secret birthmark. Best-case scenario, you're secretly a millionaire. Worst-case scenario, you get a crazy story out of it, and maybe they'll give you some money for the emotional distress. They're not eccentric, Jess. They're intense. The way that woman looked at me, It was terrifying, Brooke countered, tracing the rim of her coffee mug. And the son, Nathan, he looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. So what? He's a jerk. His dad seemed okay, and the grandma is obviously grieving. Just call. What do you have to lose? Another shift smelling like stale bread and regret? Jessica had a point. What did she have to lose? Brooke's life was a hamster wheel of work and study. She had no family to disappoint, no inheritance to protect. There was a tiny, deeply buried part of her, the part that had spent years in foster care, wondering who she was and where she came from, that was undeniably curious. The name Beatrice had used, Josephine, echoed in her mind. With a deep breath, she dialed the number. Robert Davenport answered on the second ring, his voice as calm and collected as it had been in the restaurant. He apologized again, profusely, for his mother's behavior. She hasn't stopped talking about you, he admitted, a weary sigh in his voice. I know this is an incredible imposition, but it would mean the world to her, to us, if you would consider meeting. We could come to you, or perhaps you would be our guest for lunch at our home this Saturday. We would, of course, send a car. The offer hung in the air, dripping with a casual wealth that was alien to Brooke. A car. Lunch at their home. It felt like stepping into another dimension. Against her better judgment, the flicker of curiosity won. Okay, she heard herself say. Saturday would be fine. On Saturday morning, a sleek black car, so quiet it seemed to glide rather than drive, pulled up in front of her run-down apartment building. The driver, a man in a crisp suit, held the door for her as if she were royalty. The half-hour drive took them out of the city and into the rolling hills of the countryside, where the houses grew larger and the fences taller. They finally turned onto a long, tree-lined driveway that led to what could only be described as an estate. It was a sprawling stone manor that looked like it had been plucked straight from the English countryside, surrounded by acres of perfectly manicured lawns. Brooke's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just money. This was a dynasty. Robert Davenport met her at the door, his expression warm and welcoming. He led her through a grand foyer with a soaring ceiling and a marble floor that echoed with their footsteps. My mother is in the sunroom. She's been looking forward to this all morning, he said, guiding her down a long hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors. Beatrice was seated in a plush armchair overlooking a vast garden bursting with roses. She looked smaller, more fragile than she had in the restaurant. When she saw Brooke, her face lit up with a fragile, hopeful smile. Nathan was there too, standing by the fireplace, his arms crossed, his expression a carefully constructed mask of indifference. My dear child, Beatrice said, her voice trembling as she held out a withered hand. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. Brooke sat hesitantly on the edge of a pristine white sofa. An uncomfortable silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Beatrice broke it. My daughter, she began, her eyes distant, fixed on a memory. Her name was Josephine. She was a whirlwind, full of life, but so reckless. Headstrong, she had her father's temper and my heart. A dangerous combination. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When she was 19, she fell in with a bad crowd. A boy, a drifter. We disapproved, of course. Her father, Arthur, he was a very proud, very firm man. He forbade her from seeing him. They fought terrible, terrible fights. Beatrice's voice cracked. And then, one night, she was gone. She left a note, said she was running away to live her own life, and that we shouldn't look for her. Robert picked up the story, his voice somber. "We tried. We hired private investigators for years, but it was like she vanished off the face of the earth. That was 25 years ago." 25 years, 2 months, and 12 days, Beatrice corrected softly. "And in all that time, I have prayed for a sign, for some news, and then I saw you." She leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "That mark on your wrist. Josephine was born with the exact same one. A perfect crescent moon. My husband's mother had it, and her mother before her. It's a Davenport mark passed down through the women in our line." Brooke felt a chill run down her spine. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. I was a foundling," Brooke said quietly, feeling the need to fill the silence. "Left at a hospital in a nearby town. No note, no name. The nurses called me Brooke. Miller is just a common name they assigned me." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The hope in her eyes intensified, becoming a blazing fire. "Don't you see, Robert? It all fits." She would have been scared, alone. She would have wanted her baby to be safe. Nathan finally spoke, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, it's a perfect story. A little too perfect, don't you think? An orphan waitress with a convenient birthmark just happens to serve the one family in the city who might be looking for someone like her. It's a miracle, or a very clever scam." "Nathan," Robert's voice was sharp. "That's enough." "Is it?" Nathan pushed himself off the mantelpiece and took a step toward Brooke, his eyes narrowing. "How long have you been planning this? Did you research us? Find out about my long-lost aunt and get a tattoo to match?" The accusation was so vile, so unexpected, that it took Brooke's breath away. "A tattoo?" she stammered, outrage giving her a sliver of courage. "Are you serious? I've had this my entire life." She thrust her wrist forward. "Look at it. Does that look like a tattoo to you?" Robert stepped between them. "Nathan, apologize to Ms. Miller at once. She is our guest." Nathan just scoffed, turning to stare out the window. "I'm just being realistic. You're being led by sentiment. Think about what this means. If it's true, she would be an heir, entitled to a share of the Davenport fortune." The word fortune hung in the opulent room, making everything feel cold and transactional. Brooke suddenly felt nauseous. This wasn't about a grieving grandmother finding a long-lost connection. It was about money, about a legacy she had no part in. "I don't want your money," Brooke said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I didn't ask for any of this. I think I should go." She stood up, her dreamlike curiosity curdling into a nightmare of suspicion and greed. "No, please don't go," Beatrice cried, tears streaming down her face again. "He didn't mean it. He's just protective." "Please, my dear, we just need to know for sure." Robert put a calming hand on Brooke's arm. "Nathan is out of line, but he has raised a valid, if tactless, point. Speculation and stories aren't enough. There is a way to know for certain." He looked from his mother to Brooke, his expression serious. "A DNA test." The suggestion of a DNA test landed in the silent sunroom with the force of a gavel. It was a cold, scientific solution to a deeply emotional puzzle. For Nathan, it was a weapon to expose a fraud. For Robert, a logical step to manage an escalating situation. For Beatrice, it was the final key to unlocking a door she had been rattling for 25 years. And for Brooke, it was terrifying. Her entire identity was built on a foundation of not knowing. She was Brooke Miller, a blank slate. To have that slate suddenly scribbled on with a history, a name, a family, it was overwhelming. What if it was true? Her life of scraping by, of feeling utterly alone in the world, could be over. The thought was as frightening as it was seductive. What if it wasn't true? Then she would be cast out of this strange fairy tale, sent back to her real life with the added sting of humiliation and a glimpse of a world she could never have. A test, Brooke repeated softly, looking at the three distinct faces of the Davenport family. The hopeful grandmother, the cautious son, the hostile grandson. It would be simple, non-invasive, Robert explained calmly, as if discussing a business transaction. We would use a reputable private lab. Everything would be handled with the utmost discretion. We would compare your sample with mine. As Josephine's brother, the genetic link would be undeniable. Beatrice nodded eagerly. Yes, Robert, arrange it as soon as possible. Nathan smirked. Don't rush to redecorate her room just yet, Grandma. Let's see what the science says. Despite Nathan's venom, Brooke agreed. The not knowing was now worse than any potential outcome. She needed an answer, if only to silence the wild what-ifs that had started to scream in her head. The next week was a strange limbo. Robert arranged for a private nurse to visit Brooke's apartment to take a simple cheek swab. The process was sterile and quick, but the implications felt momentous. As the nurse sealed the sample in a biohazard bag, Brooke felt like she was mailing a piece of her soul to a laboratory. The Davenports, in the interim, began to cautiously weave her into their lives. Beatrice would call her every day, her voice frail and full of questions. She wanted to know Brooke's favorite color, what she was studying, what her dreams were. They were simple questions, but they felt loaded, as if Beatrice were trying to superimpose the ghost of her daughter onto the blank canvas of Brooke's life. Robert, true to his word, wanted to compensate her. He sent over a check that was more than she made in 6 months. Brooke stared at it, feeling a fresh wave of nausea. Cashing it felt like accepting payment for a role she might not even be qualified to play. She tucked it away in a drawer, untouched. More practically, Robert insisted she quit her job at the Gilded Spoon, at least until the results came in. You shouldn't have to deal with the stress and the gossip, he'd said. Let us take care of your expenses for the time being. It's the least we can do. Reluctantly, she agreed. The freedom from the daily grind was intoxicating, but it also made her feel unmoored. She was living in a holding pattern, her life on pause, waiting for a verdict from a lab. Nathan remained her shadow of doubt. He made no effort to contact her, but she felt his presence. One afternoon, Jessica came home from class, her eyes wide. "You're not going to believe this," Jessica said, dropping her books on the table. "I saw him, the grandson, Nathan. He was on campus talking to Professor Albright from the genetics department." Brooke's blood ran cold. "What? Why?" "I don't know. I just overheard a bit. He was asking about birthmarks, genetic markers, how easy it would be to fake something, or if a DNA test could be fooled. He's investigating you, Brooke. He's trying to find a hole in your story." The news was a punch to the gut. While Beatrice was planning a future, Nathan was digging through her non-existent past, determined to prove she was a liar. The realization hardened something inside her. A part of her now wanted the test to be positive, just to see the look on his face. A few days later, Robert invited her back to the estate. The DNA results were due the following morning, and Beatrice wanted them to be together when they received the news. The atmosphere in the house was thick with anticipation. Beatrice was practically vibrating with nervous energy, flitting about the room, tidying things that were already tidy. Robert was pacing, checking his phone every few minutes. Even Nathan seemed to have lost his cool composure. He stood staring out the window, his jaw tight. To pass the time, Beatrice brought out a dusty, leather-bound photo album. "This is Josephine," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she opened it, to a picture of a laughing, rebellious-looking teenager with a wild mane of dark hair and startlingly bright eyes. Brooke leaned in, her own heart thudding. She searched the girl's face for any hint of herself, any familiar curve of a cheek or shape of a smile. She saw nothing. The girl in the photo was a stranger. Beatrice, however, saw everything. "Look, Robert, the eyes. They're the same shade of blue. I told you." Robert looked, his expression unreadable. "They are similar, Mother." Brooke felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. What if Beatrice's hope was so powerful it was making her see things that weren't there? The weight of the old woman's expectations felt crushing to be the source of such immense joy or such devastating disappointment. It was too much to bear. As the evening wore on, Beatrice shared more stories of Josephine. Her first horse, her secret treehouse, her love of thunderstorms. Brooke listened, feeling like an imposter. She was absorbing the memories of a dead girl, a girl she probably had no connection to. Before she left, Robert had insisted on booking her a room at a nearby hotel so she wouldn't have to travel back and forth. He pulled her aside in the grand foyer. "Brooke," he said, his voice low, "I want you to be prepared for any outcome tomorrow. My mother, she has built this up in her mind to be a certainty. If it's not the news she's hoping for, it will destroy her. And if it is," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "if it is, our lives will change forever, and so will yours. I just want you to know that whatever happens, I am grateful that you have given my mother this period of hope." His words, meant to be reassuring, only amplified her anxiety. She was a vessel for this family's hope and grief. Tomorrow that vessel would either be filled to the brim or shattered completely. As the car pulled away from the magnificent, intimidating house, Brooke pressed her hand against the window, feeling more alone than ever. The next morning, Brooke met the Davenports in Robert's study. The room was imposing, lined with dark wood shelves filled with leather-bound books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in a century. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, and on it a laptop was open. Waiting. The air was so thick with tension, it felt hard to breathe. Beatrice was seated in a wing-back chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She hadn't slept. Dark circles stood out starkly against her pale skin. Nathan leaned against a bookshelf, affecting a casual pose that didn't quite hide the nervous energy thrumming through him. Robert stood behind the desk, his shoulders squared as if bracing for an impact. "The lab emailed the report a few minutes ago," Robert announced to the silent room. His voice was steady, but Brooke saw a slight tremor in his hand as he moved the mouse. "The file is password protected. I have the code. Are we all ready?" Beatrice gave a small, jerky nod. Brooke's own heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt strangely disconnected, almost as if she were observing a scene from a movie where she was just a background character. Robert typed in the password and clicked the mouse. A PDF document sprang onto the screen, packed with clinical jargon and complex charts. A layperson wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of the genetic sequences, but the conclusion, highlighted at the bottom of the first page, was written in clear, unmistakable English. Robert's face drained of color. He read it once, then again, his brow furrowing in confusion. He seemed to physically shrink before their very eyes. "What is it?" Beatrix's voice was a thin, reedy whisper. "Tell us." Robert slowly raised his eyes from the screen, his gaze meeting his mother's. His expression was one of deep pity and sorrow. "It's negative," he said, the words hitting the silence like heavy stones. "There's no match. According to this report, There is a 0% probability that Brooke Miller is the daughter of Josephine Davenport. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. It was as if every last bit of air had been sucked out of the room, leaving them gasping. Brooke felt the floor give way beneath her. 0%. Not a slim chance. Not a distant relation. Nothing. A complete stranger. Beatrice made a small, wounded sound, like an animal in pain. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, that's not possible. The lab made a mistake. They have to have made a mistake. The birthmark." "The science is clear, Mother," Robert said gently, his voice strained. He walked over and knelt by her chair. "I'm so sorry." Nathan let out a short, sharp breath that sounded almost like a laugh. He pushed himself off the bookshelf, a look of smug, bitter vindication plastered on his face. Well, what a surprise. I told you from the very beginning this was a scam." He turned his cold, triumphant gaze on Brooke. "Congratulations," he sneered. "It was a good performance. You almost had us. Had my grandmother convinced you were her long-lost miracle. What was the plan? Wait for the old woman to get attached and then bleed her dry?" "Nathan, stop it," Robert warned, his voice cracking with the effort. But Nathan was on a roll, his cruelty unleashed. "I bet that birthmark isn't even real. I bet it washes off with a bit of soap and water. You're pathetic, preying on a grieving family." Each word landed like a physical blow. Brooke felt dizzy, the room tilting around her. The hope she hadn't even fully allowed herself to acknowledge was now a gaping, painful wound. And on top of that, this vicious, baseless attack. She looked from Nathan's hateful face to Robert's pitying one, but it was the sight of Beatrix that shattered her. The old woman wasn't looking at her anymore. All the light, all the frantic hope that had animated her for the past week had been extinguished. Her face was a gray, slack mask of utter devastation. She looked at Brooke, and for the first time, she saw only a stranger, a waitress, a disappointment. The rejection in that single glance was more painful than any of Nathan's insults. I didn't lie," Brooke whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. "I never asked for any of this. I told you it was probably a coincidence. A very profitable coincidence for you," Nathan shot back. "A free week off work, a nice hotel stay. That's enough," Robert roared, finally getting to his feet. He looked at Brooke, his face etched with regret. "Miss Miller? Brooke, I am truly sorry for this, for my son's behavior, and for putting you through this emotional ordeal. It was unfair of us. We let hope cloud our judgment." His tone was formal again. The brief intimacy they had shared was gone. She was Ms. Miller once more. "I think it's best if you go now," he said quietly, not as a request, but as a dismissal. He reached into his jacket. "Let me write you a check for your trouble." "No," Brooke said, finding a sliver of strength in her humiliation. "I don't want your money. I never did." She turned and walked out of the study, not daring to look back at Beatrix's crumpled form. She walked, head held high, through the echoing marble foyer, past the portraits of the Davenport ancestors, who were not and never would be her family. She didn't stop until she was outside in the crisp autumn air, the massive oak door clicking shut behind her with dreadful finality. She walked the entire length of the long, tree-lined driveway, her legs moving robotically. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away. The black car that had ferried her to this gilded cage was nowhere in sight. She had been discarded. The fairy tale was over, and she was back in the real world. Only now she was more alone, more lost than she had ever been before. The crescent moon on her wrist felt like a cruel joke, a meaningless mark on the skin of a nobody. The weeks that followed the DNA test were a gray blur of existence for Brooke. She'd had to beg Mr. Henderson for her job back at the Gilded Spoon, enduring his suspicious questions and the pitying stares of her coworkers. The untouched check from Robert Davenport sat in her drawer like a monument to her humiliation, and she eventually tore it into tiny pieces. Life wasn't just back to normal. It was worse. The quiet loneliness of her apartment now felt like a suffocating silence. Before, her unknown past was a neutral void. Now it was a confirmed emptiness. Meanwhile, a different kind of silence had fallen over the Davenport estate. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of grief. Beatrix had retreated into herself, a ghost haunting the opulent rooms of her home. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was listless. The brief, brilliant flame of hope Brooke had ignited in her had been snuffed out, leaving behind only the cold ashes of her 25-year-old sorrow. Robert was consumed by a different emotion. Guilt. He felt guilty for his mother's pain, guilty for the false hope he'd allowed to fester, and guilty for the way they had treated Brooke. He couldn't shake the image of her face in the study. The shock, the hurt, the dignity she had clung to as his son flayed her with accusations. One rainy afternoon, unable to bear the funereal atmosphere of the house any longer, Robert found himself in his late father's study. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a distraction. He ran his hand along the spines of the untouched books and found himself drawn to a large, carved wooden chest in the corner of the room, a place where his father, Arthur Davenport, used to keep old business files and personal effects. Arthur had been a formidable man, proud, controlling, and emotionally distant. He had ruled his family with the same iron fist he'd ruled his company. His disapproval of Josephine's choices had been absolute. Robert opened the chest. The air smelled of old paper and leather. Beneath stacks of yellowed financial ledgers, his fingers brushed against a smaller tin box tied with a faded red ribbon. He didn't recognize it. Curiosity piqued. He lifted it out and untied the ribbon. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in a familiar, looping script. Josephine's handwriting, but they weren't addressed to her parents. They were addressed to someone named Anna, a close friend, perhaps. Robert's heart began to beat faster. These weren't the rebellious, angry letters of a runaway. These were the desperate, fearful letters of a prisoner. He sat down in his father's leather chair and began to read. October 12th, Anna, he read. He found my last letter. Father, I mean. He didn't yell. It was worse. That quiet, cold fury of his. He told me I was a disgrace to the Davenport name and that he would see me locked away before he let me run off with Daniel. He wasn't exaggerating, Anna. I saw the look in his eyes. He's locked the gate phone so I can't make calls. I'm smuggling this out with Mrs. Gable from the kitchen staff. He says Daniel is nothing but a fortune-hunting pauper. But he's wrong. Daniel sees me, not my name. Another letter, dated a week later. October 19th. Anna, I'm so scared. Father is talking about sending me away to a school in Switzerland. It's not a school. It's a sanatorium. A place for hysterical young women. He's trying to have me committed to get me away from Daniel. Mother just weeps. She's too afraid of him to stand up for me. She begs me to just do as he says, to forget Daniel, but I can't. He is my whole world. We have to run. Daniel has a plan. It's crazy, but it might be the only way. Robert's hands trembled as he read. This wasn't the story he'd been told. His father hadn't just disapproved. He had been a tyrant, a jailer. He remembered the arguments, the shouting behind closed doors, but he had been young, taught to revere his father and see his sister as wild and disobedient. He kept reading, his stomach twisting into a tight knot. The last letter was almost illegible, the ink smudged with what could have been tear stains. November 3rd. Dearest Anna, if you are reading this, it means our plan worked, or it failed spectacularly. We're leaving tonight. Daniel has arranged everything. It's going to look like I ran away, a simple note on my pillow, but we're going further than that. We have to disappear completely, or Father will never stop hunting us. He'll use all his money, all his power, and he will find me. Daniel says we have to fake my death. Can you believe it? A car accident in some small town hundreds of miles from here. A body burned beyond recognition using stolen dental records. It's insane. But it's the only way to be free of him. Don't tell anyone. Don't ever tell them. Let them think I vanished. It's better they mourn a runaway than for Father to hunt a fugitive. There is something else. Something I haven't told anyone. Not even Daniel yet. I'm pregnant, Anna. I'm going to have a baby. A little crescent moon to match my own. I have to protect this child from him, from this house, from this name. I love you. Your friend, Josephine. Robert dropped the letter as if it had burned him. Pregnant. She had been pregnant. Everything shifted. The entire foundation of his family story crumbled into dust. His sister hadn't just run away from a disapproving father. She had been fleeing an oppressive monster. She had faked her death to protect herself and her unborn child. And that child, a baby with the crescent moon birthmark, the DNA test. He replayed it in his mind. They had tested Brooke's DNA against his. It came back negative. But why? If Brooke was Josephine's daughter, she was his niece. There should have been a clear link. Unless... A dark, unthinkable thought began to form in the recesses of his mind. A thought rooted in the coldness he had always felt from his father, the strange distance in his parents' marriage, and his mother's deep, inconsolable bond with her daughter. His father had called Josephine a disgrace to the Davenport name. What if that had been more than just a turn of phrase? What if he'd meant it literally? He stood up, the letters clutched in his hand. He looked at the portrait of his father that hung over the mantelpiece, stern, proud, unyielding. He had worshipped this man, feared him, obeyed him, and this man had terrorized his own daughter and lied to his family for a quarter of a century. The guilt he felt for Brooke was now dwarfed by a tidal wave of anger and betrayal. The DNA test wasn't a mistake. It was the wrong test. He strode out of the study, his purpose clear. He had to find Brooke. And then he had to confront his mother. He had a feeling there was one more secret buried in this house of lies. Finding Brooke was harder than Robert expected. She had moved out of her apartment without a forwarding address. The Gilded Spoon reported she had quit again, this time for good. It was as if she, like Josephine, had decided to vanish. But Robert Davenport had resources his sister never did. He hired a private investigator, the best in the city, and within 48 hours he had a location, a small, unassuming apartment complex on the industrial side of town. He drove there himself, the tin box of Josephine's letters on the passenger seat beside him. He found Brooke just as she was leaving, carrying a laundry basket. She looked thinner, her face pale, the spark in her eyes dimmed. When she saw him approaching, her body stiffened. She clutched the laundry basket like a shield. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I need to talk to you, Robert," said, his own voice strained. "I know you have no reason to listen to me, but please, I've discovered something. Something about my sister, about everything." Brooke's expression was a wall of skepticism. "If you've come to offer me money again, you can save your breath." "No," Robert said, shaking his head. "I've come to apologize and to ask for your help." He told her everything. He stood there on the cracked pavement of the parking lot and read her excerpts from Josephine's letters, about her fear of Arthur, about her love for a man named Daniel, about the plan to fake her death, and finally about the baby. As Brooke listened, Her wall of indifference began to crack. The story resonated with the fragments of her own lonely existence, a baby left with nothing, protected from a past she never knew. Her hand instinctively went to her wrist, to the crescent moon that had caused her so much pain. "Why would the DNA test be negative?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "If I'm her daughter, you're my uncle. It should have been a match." "That's the question I've been asking myself for 2 days," Robert said, his face grim, "and I think I know the answer. But I need to hear it from my mother." He looked at Brooke, his eyes pleading. "Will you come with me? I know I have no right to ask, but I think she needs to see you. We all need the truth, whatever it is." Brooke was torn. Returning to that house, to the site of her deepest humiliation, was the last thing she wanted to do. But the story in those letters had planted a new seed in her heart. This wasn't about the Davenport fortune anymore. This was about a terrified 19-year-old girl named Josephine and the baby she had tried to save. This was about her. She nodded slowly. "I'll come." When they arrived at the estate, the atmosphere was as heavy and somber as they'd left it. They found Beatrix in the sunroom, staring blankly at the rose garden. Nathan was with her, reading a book, though it was clear he was only there to keep watch over his grandmother. When he saw Brooke walk in behind his father, he shot to his feet, his face darkening with anger. "What is she doing here?" he demanded, stepping in front of his grandmother protectively. "Haven't you done enough damage?" "Nathan, be quiet and listen," Robert said, his voice carrying an authority his son had never heard before. He walked over to his mother's chair and knelt before her, placing the tin box in her lap. "Mother, I found these in Father's chest. They're from Josephine." Beatrix flinched as if the box were hot. She looked down at it, then up at Robert, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "Read them," Robert urged gently. "Or let me read them to you. We need to talk about what really happened to Josephine. We need to talk about Father." For the next hour, Robert's voice filled the sunroom as he read his sister's words aloud. He did not spare his mother any of it, the descriptions of Arthur's cruelty, Josephine's terror, the desperate plan to escape, and the final, shocking revelation of her pregnancy. With every word, Beatrix seemed to shrink further into her chair. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Nathan stood frozen, his earlier animosity draining away, replaced by a look of horrified disbelief. The grandfather he had been taught to admire was being painted as a monster. The aunt he'd never known was not a reckless runaway, but a victim. When Robert finished the last letter, a profound silence descended. He looked at his mother, his heart breaking for her, but his resolve firm. "The DNA test, Mother," he said softly. "It said Brooke wasn't my niece. There's only one reason that could be true." He paused, the terrible question hanging between them. "Josephine wasn't my full sister, was she? Arthur Davenport wasn't her biological father?" The room held its breath. Nathan stared at his grandmother, his mouth agape. Beatrix finally broke. A lifetime of secrets, of fear, and guilt came pouring out in a torrent of sobs. She clutched the letters to her chest, her body racked with tremors. "He was a cold man," she cried, her voice raw with ancient pain. "Your father, Arthur, he was married to his business, to his name. He gave me this house. He gave me jewels. He gave me everything. But himself. I was so lonely." She looked up, her tear-filled eyes finding Robert's, then flitting to Brooke. "It was years before you were born, Robert. There was someone else. An artist, a gentle, kind man, who made me feel alive. It was brief, a terrible mistake, but I loved him. And I got pregnant." She took a shuddering breath. "It was Josephine. I tried to pass her off as Arthur's, and he He may have suspected, but he accepted it to avoid a scandal. But he never, ever forgave me. He raised her as a Davenport, but he never loved her. He saw my betrayal in her face every single day. That's why he was so hard on her. That's why he hated Daniel. It was history repeating itself, his daughter falling for a man with nothing to his name, just like her mother did. The confession filled the room, shattering the pristine image of the Davenport dynasty forever. Robert was not Josephine's full brother, but her half-brother. And the birthmark? Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a Davenport mark, Beatrix sobbed. That was a lie I told myself for so long I started to believe it. It came from him, from her real father. He had the same perfect crescent moon on his wrist. Suddenly, it all made sense. The DNA test hadn't failed. It had told the truth. Brooke was not genetically related to Robert because Robert was not related to Josephine's biological father. Brooke stood by the door, a silent witness to the demolition of a family. She was no longer an outsider. She was the catalyst, the living proof of a secret that had festered for over 50 years. Nathan, looking completely shattered, finally moved. He walked over to Brooke, his eyes filled with a shame so profound he could barely meet her gaze. I am so sorry, he stammered, his voice thick. For everything I said, for how I treated you. I was wrong about everything. Robert looked from his devastated mother to the granddaughter she had unknowingly found. There's only one way to be certain, he said, his voice filled with a new, somber resolve. We need another test, this time comparing Brooke's DNA not to mine, but directly to yours, Mother. The second DNA test was arranged with a quiet, solemn urgency. The atmosphere was entirely different this time. The frantic hope and bitter suspicion were gone, replaced by a fragile, shared need for truth. There were no accusations, no grand pronouncements, just a family fractured and raw, waiting for a final piece of their history to click into place. During the week-long wait for the results, the dynamics within the Davenport estate underwent a seismic shift. Nathan, humbled and deeply ashamed, tried to atone for his earlier cruelty. He called Brooke, not to interrogate her, but to talk. He asked about her life, her studies, her dreams, the same questions his grandmother had asked, but this time they were tinged with genuine interest and regret. He told her about the grandfather he had idolized and the complex, difficult man he was now learning his father, Robert, truly was. A tentative, fragile bridge was being built between them, spanning the chasm of their first impressions. Robert focused on his mother, sitting with her for hours as she finally unburdened herself of the secrets she had carried for decades. He learned about her loveless marriage, her brief, cherished affair, and the crushing guilt of watching her husband punish her daughter for her own transgressions. He was not just comforting his mother. He was meeting her, truly meeting her for the very first time. Brooke, at Robert's insistence, stayed at the estate. She was given a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment, a beautiful room overlooking the gardens. But she felt less like a guest, and more like a ghost wandering the quiet halls, trying to imagine the life of the young woman who had fled this gilded cage. She found herself standing before the portrait of Arthur Davenport, staring into his cold, painted eyes, and felt an unexpected surge of gratitude for Josephine's courage. Her mother, and she was starting to allow herself to think of her that way, had saved her from him. The day the results were due, they gathered not in the intimidating study, but in the sunroom, the same room where Beatrix had first told Brooke about her lost daughter. The morning light streamed in, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Robert's laptop sat on a small table. He opened the email from the lab, his movements slow and deliberate. He typed in the password and opened the PDF. This time he didn't read it to himself first. He simply turned the screen so they could all see. There, at the bottom of the page, was the conclusion. Maternal match. The DNA profile of Beatrix Davenport is consistent with that of a biological grandmother to the subject, Brooke Miller. The probability of this relationship is 99.999%. The clinical words sang with a power that transcended science. 999%. A choked sob escaped Beatrix's lips. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of profound, earth-shattering release. She reached out a trembling hand towards Brooke, her eyes swimming with tears. "My granddaughter," she whispered the words, a prayer answered after a lifetime of waiting. "My Josephine's baby girl." Brooke moved towards her, her own tears blurring her vision. She took her grandmother's hand, and this time the touch wasn't a desperate grab in a restaurant, but a gentle, welcoming embrace. She knelt by Beatrix's chair, and the old woman wrapped her arms around her, holding on as if she would never let go. Decades of grief, loneliness, and secrecy melted away in that single moment. Robert stood back, watching them, a sad yet peaceful smile on his face. His family was broken, yes, but it was no longer built on lies. Nathan came and stood beside his father, placing a hand on his shoulder. Nathan then looked at Brooke, who was now nestled safely in his grandmother's arms. For the first time, he didn't see her as an intruder or a problem that needed solving. Instead, he saw her as family, as his cousin. The questions that followed weren't about money or the inheritance that was at stake. They were about life, about understanding their shared history. Robert, using his considerable resources, managed to piece together the story of what happened after Josephine ran away. They discovered that she and Daniel had started a new life together, using different names, in a quiet, small town in Oregon. To protect her daughter from Arthur Davenport, she had made the difficult decision to give her up for a closed adoption, always intending to return for her once it was safe to do so. But fate had other plans. Only 3 years later, Josephine and Daniel were tragically killed in a genuine car accident. It was a cruel twist of fate, leaving their young daughter an orphan with no one to turn to. Her true identity was buried with them, lost to the world. Brooke Miller finally had a history to call her own. She had a mother named Josephine, a grandmother named Beatrice, an uncle named Robert, and a cousin named Nathan. She had a story, a messy, complicated, tragic, and ultimately beautiful story that was uniquely hers. Standing in the sun-drenched room, surrounded by the remnants of her newfound family, Brooke gazed down at the crescent moon mark on her wrist. For 24 years, it had been a symbol of her solitude, a constant reminder of everything she didn't know about herself. Now she finally understood its meaning. It wasn't a question mark, a symbol of uncertainty. It was a period, a definitive end to one chapter of her life. It was the end of the story of a lonely orphan and the beginning of a brand new one. A story that she would finally have the opportunity to write for herself, shaping her own destiny. The Davenport fortune was rightfully hers. However, as she looked into the tearful, smiling face of the grandmother who had found her in a crowded restaurant, Brooke realized that she had already inherited the only thing that truly mattered: family. And so, Brooke's life was changed forever, not by winning the lottery or some sudden stroke of luck, but by a unique birthmark on her skin that held a secret history of love, fear, and sacrifice. Her story reminds us that family is not always simple or straightforward. Sometimes it's a tangled web of secrets carefully kept to protect the ones we love. Sometimes the truth has the power to shatter the foundations of everything we thought we knew, only to help us rebuild on something far stronger and more real. What would you do if a stranger suddenly claimed to be your family? Would you be brave enough to seek the truth, no matter where it might lead you? The most incredible stories are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for a single moment, a single touch, to bring them into the light. Thank you for joining us for this amazing story. If it touched your heart, made you think, or kept you on the edge of your seat, please show your support. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good story with plenty of twists and turns. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that you won't want to miss. Click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Until next time, remember to look closer. Everyone has a story to tell.